Good afternoon, everyone. It's 4 o'clock or thereabouts. And I see that you're all regulars, and I just want to thank you all for your commitment. I'm Andy Boatwright, General Manager, Zeeland Board of Public Works, in case you had forgotten. It's been a long time since we've last met. It was in January. So this is our third stakeholder working group meeting, and I just wanted to run down some statistics here that I was intrigued by in terms of this process. In terms of public meetings, we began in October with a public meeting, and welcome. Sign in, please, if you don't mind. Thank you. And then another meeting November 25th. And then that was our first stakeholder working group meeting, I believe. And the second one was January 26th, and then, of course, today. Over the course of time, we've had 56 or so attendees. Many of you have been to all three of these meetings, and we thank you for your commitment. We've sent out a survey. As you're aware, we received 200 plus responses to the survey. Press releases, we stood up a website. Numerous slide presentations have been placed on that website. Even today's is there for your reference. And all of the past presentations are there. All of these sessions have been recorded. So all of the video recordings are on the website. So a pretty good record, I would say, of the activities that have been associated with this undertaking. So, am I advancing the slides? I see a different slide here, so I don't want to. All right. Anyway, so let's get into why we're here today. But before I do this, I want to say Bob Mulder, our power supply manager, has just done a yeoman's job in pulling all of this together. He's been the one leading this effort, and so Bob, congratulations on a great job. Really appreciate that. Also, today is Bob's 8th work anniversary date. Is that right, Bob? Yeah. So let's congratulate Bob on his 8th anniversary. Okay.
It's gone quickly.
Okay. And it's been very busy. All right, so why are we here today? We're going to talk about the IRP process and the preliminary results. There's going to be a lot of slides here, very busy slides. You may have questions along the way. Please don't hesitate to raise your hand if you need clarification along the way. The slides are very technical. They're just more so in the past than in the past, so just be aware that's, if you haven't previewed them already, this is something that you're going to witness here in this session. We're going to talk about considerations for portfolio evaluation and collaboration opportunities. So with that, I'm going to ask Bob to come on up and start us off. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Again, thank you all for coming. It's a beautiful day outside. I mean, it feels like spring again compared to what we just had, and then again a few days ago when it was almost summer. So we're looking forward. So I want to talk about the agenda. Stuart Ramsey, who is our meeting facilitator, couldn't be here today. So I'm going to take that role. So safety and meeting guidelines, I want to talk about that. Brad Kushner is going to go through the IRP process in significant depth, present some of the preliminary reviews. We've talked about that a little bit in previous meetings. He's going to get pretty deep into that, as Andy mentioned, talk about different ways to evaluate the portfolios. I'm going to touch on near-term action plans. We're also going to introduce Steve Donkersloot with the Michigan Public Power Agency. We're very fortunate to have Steve here today. He's going to talk about our collaboration between Zeeland and MPPA. I'm proud to say Zeeland was a founding member of MPPA back in 1978, and a long-term supporter, and great collaboration there, and opportunities looking forward for us to even strengthen that role. And then we want to talk about some questions and anything that you would like to hit a little bit deeper. And then the next steps, of course. So for safety, exits clearly marked. Make your way upstairs, of course. Bypass the elevator. Mustering point is on the east side of the building on Church Street. AED location, there's one upstairs. I don't think there's any in the basement here, but up on the main level, there's an AED. And of course, if there's any emergencies, hopefully we don't have any, dial 911. Just guides for today's sessions, respectful dialogue. There's no concern on that, but obviously we each have opinions, and we'd love to hear them, but just be respectful of others. Questions and comments are public, and just transparency of questions and answers. That's why the slides are out there. That's why the meeting's recorded if somebody can't attend. And just wanted to keep you appraised of the commonly used terms at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brad Kushner from Enfra. Thanks, Brad.
Good afternoon. Thank you again for being with us. We certainly appreciate everybody's time commitments. We do have a pretty long slide deck in terms of number of slides and a lot of technical material. I don't know if anybody's had an opportunity to look at it ahead of time. Certainly questions along the way are welcome and appreciated. Probably going to spend the most time on the kind of the first sets of slides. There's a number of similar slides, and then kind of the dialogue will flow from there. So at any point, we're happy to kind of go backwards or jump ahead, whatever is most useful for you all. Also, we have had, as Andy mentioned, 3 stakeholder. This is the 3rd one, so 2 previous meetings. We talked about a lot of concepts. We try not to go back too much, but we will try to refresh some of the major ones. Again, the terminology is listed at the end of the presentation, but if anybody needs a little bit of a refresh on anything we've talked about before, please don't hesitate to ask. This chart ought to look familiar. This is kind of a long-term view of the incremental capacity required, incremental megawatts required to meet Zeeland's projected, I'm about to give up on this thing, the projected capacity requirements over the next 20 plus years. No, I was looking for the laser pointer on it. I'm probably not pressing hard enough somewhere. So we do a long-term load forecast. We take into account our existing resources, the various megawatts from the different types of resources, how they're accredited through MISO. Certainly, thank you to Steve. We worked a lot with MPPA early in the process to kind of get this consistent with MPPA's view on current resource accreditations and future resource accreditations. But what is this saying in the big picture? We have a need that starts to materialize, a need for capacity to meet our planning reserve margin in the 2030 timeframe. And I think in previous conversations, we've talked a little bit about what Zeeland does to meet some of those needs. It's not necessarily we need to go out and put new resources, new equipment in. There's a bilateral market for capacity purchases. And as those start to drop off, that's what's, combined with load growth, that's what's driving that near-term need in the 2030 timeframe. So kind of fundamental to the IRP is, when do we start looking at meeting these capacity requirements? Here we are in 2026. There's a long lead time for some types of resources, but it's also informative to maybe kind of look at some variations on when new resources might be available. So in general, in the 2029 time period, the model, the IRP model, we allowed some of the new resources to be added. Local peaking generation, that's what we had referred to and will continue to refer to as either reciprocating internal combustion engines or RICE units similar to our existing resources, or some smaller scale combustion turbine resources, and then also renewables, combination of solar, wind, and energy storage. Battery energy storage system is best, the abbreviation there. So those can be added earlier than some of the larger resources that maybe have some more longer lead time or construction time or might require us to partner with another utility or developer or some other entity to take a share of a larger resource. So the larger resources that require partnership are assumed available as early as 2030. That's a fairly aggressive time frame. So one of the things we wanted to look at, and we'll refer to that as the terminology we'll get to here shortly, economically optimized, but we wanted to look at, okay, if we can get it maybe a few years later, not necessarily in 2030, does that change how different resources fit into our system? So for lack of a better way to put it, this is what the model sees. This is what the model solves to based on all the other assumptions that go into the IRP model. We've structured the IRP to look at scenarios and sensitivities. And going back to our previous stakeholder meeting, kind of looked at two bookends. Business as usual, so what we're doing now, regulations that are applicable now, affecting our decision making now. And then we know that there's Michigan Public Act 235, PA 235, which sets forth compliance targets, magnitude, as well as years for a combination of renewable energy resources and clean energy. So RES, renewable energy standards, and CES, clean energy standards. So our bookends are business as usual with no consideration of how resource decisions may be influenced by PA 235, and PA 235 as it currently exists, which calls for a ramp up to 50% renewable energy beginning in 2030, I believe, and then it goes from there. And then within each of those scenarios, we look at sensitivities. So all the different variables we've talked about before are subject to change, particularly load growth and maybe fuel price projections are variables that we subject to sensitivity analysis to say, okay, we know we're not going to be right with our projection out for the next 30 years, but let's look at our expectation. And then if that assumption changes and our loads are lower than forecast, or our loads are higher than forecast, or our fuel prices differ from forecast, how does that affect our resource decisions? So we can look and we can see, well, there's going to be a cost impact, but do variations in those assumptions really change what we need to do in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and beyond? And that's what we try to get out of the sensitivity analysis. So alternative load projections, alternative fuel price projections, this piece here about associated market prices. We do model interaction with the market through MISO, and as fuel prices change, the market prices are going to change. Yes, sir.
So on the PA 235, we talked about that a lot. Mm-hmm. The standard is really high, and everybody's planning for it, but maybe not execute it. I saw a Sunday morning news show, I don't know if it's To the Point or one of those, where they had a local or a statewide representative on, and they mentioned that. And he said, there's no way companies are going to be able to meet that. They're going to have to change. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I don't know if you guys are hearing that too, or you're just planning on it as written and nobody's going to change it. But his opinion was there's no way. It's going to cost way too much to meet it for all these companies.
We're going to all look at each other and then figure out who actually wants to speak to that first. But so that I guess start by saying that's not surprising to hear that. And it is something that as we get later in the presentation, we have done some analysis to say, okay, we've got these bookends, it's here or it's not here. What if something happens in the middle? And we'll kind of talk about how we manage our resource planning to provide for some flexibility in case things do change. But your specific question about kind of what have we heard about potential changes, maybe I'll let Bob or Steve talk to that.
Yeah, I think we all recognize that those objectives are extremely ambitious. I think from a practical standpoint, we all question if they can be hit. If you look at how much state solar or wind that would take and kind of back into that into acres per year, acres a day, whatever that is, that's a very hard number to achieve. That said, that is the law of the land, as it's been passed. And as we've been, early on when we started working through this and trying to look at different models, trying to kind of conjecture what could change. Could the Could the targets change? Could the goals change? So instead of being, 100% carbon free by 2040 or 90% effective carbon capture on natural gas by 2040, does that become 2045? Does it become 2050? And those are all possibilities, but there is no crystal ball to say that's what the legislature would consider. So we didn't feel it was appropriate to arbitrarily kind of set what we think might be. So we kind of looked at these right now, and Brad will get into that. It's kind of like the bookends, the business as usual. If P 235 didn't exist, what's that look like going forward? I think as a team, we feel probably the standards are going to have to change a bit. They're going to have to be relaxed. I don't think they'll go away. I think the reality will set in, the potential impact to reliability, and then the potential cost implications of that. We'll have to temper those goals. And I think, looking forward, we want to serve the community as reliably as possible with the cheapest energy possible to make sure we're economically advantaged and that we're providing our customers with what they need to do business and provide for their families economically. But I think we all want a greener, cleaner future down the road. So it's how do we get there in a measured manner that I think is responsible on all fronts, both sustainability, decarbonization, but also in a manner that doesn't shock ratepayers and, number one, reliability. So I'm not trying to not answer your question, sir, but it's as we start looking at, that's where it becomes difficult. We know just planning for business as usual, that's not what 235 says we have to do. Planning for 235 exclusively is extremely challenging. So by setting those bookmarks, we said, now how do we make a decision here, knowing this is what we said we have to do? We don't think will be there. If we move too fast, as we get into, there are implications to cost significantly. So how do we try to make the best decision possible for Zeeland based on what we know? So that'll get borne out here a bit as Brad gets into the details, but great question.
Yeah, I think you guys have a really big challenge because the business as usual isn't realistic and we want it to be more sustainable.
Yeah.
But the requirement is way out here and it's, okay, somewhere in between.
It's a big challenge. Absolutely. I think we all hope to, a little bit personally excited about what's happening at Palisades, possibly SMRs. I mean, that hopefully, kind of the American spirit spurs innovation, spurs entrepreneurship, right? And so I think with some of that incentive, can it be done? I think we can do anything, but it has to be on a timeline that's workable. And I have to say, at utility scale, it's a little more challenging in some instances. So,
Yeah. I think one thing to keep in mind too is the foundation that Zeeland has to work towards meeting those requirements. Y'all, I keep saying, we already talked about, I don't mean it like you should remember this, but one of the focus points of our last stakeholder meeting was to review the different types of resource then the power purchases. There's a number of solar and wind purchases that Zeeland already has. Those were entered into as part of diversifying Zeeland's power supply mix. Those count towards meeting the requirements of 235. So I'm not at all dismissing you. It's a big jump, but Zeeland's in an interesting position because we do have a solid foundation to grow on, and we also have some flexibility to make some decisions in the near term that maybe are beneficial regardless of how PA 235 materializes. And that's really what we're trying to hone in. We're looking at 25 plus years of planning here. We'll be back here again sometime in the next 5 or so years. Everything's going to change again. So as we're preparing this presentation, and kind of like, well, we're putting up these charts that imply we know what we're doing for the next 25 years. We don't. So we're going to try to focus on the near-term decisions, and Bob will get into a near-term action plan and make some decisions that are robust in the nature that if there are changes, whether it be regulations, whether it be fuel prices, whether it be equipment prices, load, any combination thereof, you can't look back once you make a decision, but you can continue to look forward and then reassess what you're doing with the pieces you have and then make your next incremental decision. Any other questions or comments in that regard? No? Okay. Use the term portfolio, use the term strategies a lot here, and I just use the term robust. So what are we really trying to solve for we can look at things in a number of different ways. We're trying to pick up the commonalities in resource plans, resource mixes moving forward, what decisions kind of shake out to be appropriate across the widest range of potential futures that we study. And that's what we mean by kind of a least regrets or a robust analysis. There are three kind of fundamental strategies or portfolios that we will look at and present here, each looked at with and without BA 235. So each within our business as usual scenario and each within our PA 235 compliance scenario. One is economically optimized. That is really, as the name implies, we give the model the most favorable assumptions about when resources would be available, what types of resources are available, and solve for what's most economic within all the other constraints of the model. And then we look at this large units available starting in 2035. This is an analysis that instead of allowing some of those larger resources, the more efficient and maybe lower cost to operate, but larger units that we could not do on our own or would not want to do on our own, larger combined cycle or larger combustion turbine, where we need to have a partner based on dialogue with MPPA and just what we know about what's going on around here. 2030 is a fairly aggressive assumption for that. So what happens if we push that out to 2035? There's also lead time considerations. We've been working with a client in the Southeast that is in the process of developing a 675 megawatt combined cycle, and it's been on the radar since 2021, 2022 timeframe, and it probably won't come online until 2031. So kind of being here in 2026 lines up well with the 2035 assumption. And then local generation only, we talked about the benefits of having local generation, small units that we know are there. We know they're there to serve our load when we need them. We could potentially generate some revenue by selling into the market, but it's really something that we can control. There's very little that we can control, but if we have our own resources, we can have more control over when they're built, where we put them, how many we put in, when we put them in. But the trade-off is those are relatively smaller units and have a higher cost per unit installed and a little bit more expensive to operate than some of the larger units. So just like we looked at the bookends as sort of extremes on the business as usual and 235 scenario, we look at these different strategies of economically optimized when large units are available, and okay, if we can't participate in anything with other entities and we have to do it on our own, how does that look? That's sort of the extremes that give us the widest range of possible outcomes. As I said, I'm going to spend more time on this chart than the subsequent charts that look the same. They just assess different strategies or portfolios. So this is our economically optimized strategy. This is the one where the model's free to pick resources, large unit, potential participation in large new units as soon as 2030. And on the left, you can see we look at it under the business as usual. And on the right, we look at it under the compliance with PA 235. This is megawatts. This is capacity. So we talk about resource planning. There's capacity. You need to make sure you have enough capacity to serve your load, plus your reserve margin, your planning reserve margin requirement. Over time, over the aggregate of the hours in the year, you use that capacity to generate energy. So this set of charts is focused on capacity. And that's why the gray area between the chart on the left and the chart on the right is identical, because that's representing Zeeland's existing capacity resources. And you can see they kind of step change downward. That's where some bilateral agreements, purchases fall off. That's where some contracts for renewables that we mentioned earlier expire. And there's also the assumption that at some point, some of our units, which are getting to be a little bit old, may need to be replaced. So that's why you see sort of these downward steps in it's gray on my slide anyway, so in the grayish area as far as our existing resources. And then focusing on the business as usual, again, this is just entirely economically optimized. We can put in a share of large resources as early as 2030 we might overbuild a little bit from a capacity perspective because there might be a benefit to having more of these types of resources on from an energy or what it actually costs to meet your customers' load requirements. That's where we start to see a lot of deviations between business as usual and PA 235 compliance. For example, in the business as usual, the purple represents new combined cycle. That's increments that we assume are continually available when we want them to be available, of being able to participate in new combined cycle projects or resources. And then you sort of see, as we get to some of the mid-years and out years, the rest of that gap is filled in with the orange chart, the orange bars, which represent new reciprocating internal combustion engines, or RICE units. So by and large, we've got a mix in the near term of, well, entirely in the near term anyway, new combined cycle, which again, we need to find someone to partner with because we're not going to go and develop a 650 megawatt resource on our own. And then adding some new local generation. But then when you start to look at PA 235, things really change. There's still combined cycle, new combined cycle participation in larger resources. It's just, there's less of it. But then we start to see some local generation in the near term, and we start to see additional renewables show up. And it makes sense then we get the local generation in the near term to sort of help address the intermittency of those renewable resources that are showing up in green. But then when we get out into the mid-2030s, towards the late 2030s, and then thereafter, we start to see new combined cycle with carbon capture and sequestration, which carbon capture and sequestration is a mechanism to actually capture the carbon dioxide that's emitted from combustion of natural gas. And you pump it and you pipe it and you deposit it somewhere. You can use it for oil recovery. There's other things that are beneficial use for it, but by and large, you don't put it into the atmosphere. So carbon capture and sequestration at a utility scale is still under developing and emerging technology. There's a lot of considerations related to it, but if it's there, if it's a commercially developed technology in the late 2030 timeframe, that might be something that helps utilities comply. Because to your point, like we spoke about earlier, going at meeting 235 solely with renewables is going to take a lot of land and a lot of renewable projects to meet it. So we start to see this blend of new renewables, carbon capture and sequestration, new local generation, new combined cycle, and energy storage. The kind of the navy blue at the very top of the graph is energy storage, again, which is helpful to sort of back up or support the intermittency of the new renewables that are shown in green. So commonalities, combined cycle, whether you are planning to comply with 235 or not, but then we really start to see a shift in the timing of new reciprocating engines, and PA 235 really drives how new renewables would fit into Zealand's system. Yes, sir.
Is it safe to assume, I look at the left-hand graph, and the new NGCC, and then you've got a little bit over here, but you've got the renewable CCS added to it. I would assume that CCS version of it fits the PA 235. Is that why that's so?
As a clean energy, so PA 230
It doesn't at all.
over.
On the left hand, if it was just strictly
It's just not economic to put. It's an option on the left hand in business as usual, but without clean energy targets or regulation for cost of carbon dioxide, it's not economic to do CCS.
not economical, and it doesn't support at all PA 235, just on its own.
Well,
Is that true, or?
let me try to put it a different way. If there is no requirements associated with PA 235, carbon capture and sequestration, because it's not showing up in the chart on the left, is not economic. If you have PA 235, one of the ways to comply with the clean energy standard piece of 235 is carbon capture and sequestration. Assuming you get, I think it's like a 96 or 95% capture rate. But yes, that's why we start to see it, because it becomes a dispatchable resource that you can turn on and off that supplements how renewables and other resources fit while complying with 235. Yes, sir.
And with PA 235, does the government subsidize some of that for your company, or is it fully on you guys to fund that? The renewables and the carbon capture, because you said it wasn't economical on your own, but is it economical with PA 235?
Well, so what we're seeing in the chart on the right, because we start to see carbon capture, I guess it's economic from whose perspective? I think the answer to your question is no, the government is not going to subsidize or fund the utilities costs or offset the utilities costs to meet the requirements of PA 235. There are tax incentives available, I think we've heard, and that at a federal level. They've changed quite a bit. They were very favorable towards renewable development and carbon capture and sequestration when the Inflation Reduction Act was introduced, the IRA Act. That's since been, technical term, repealed. It's no longer there. And we have the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OBBBA. OBBBA has some incentives for renewables, and this is not tax advice, consultant caveat, but at a high level they have incentives for renewables. Those incentives expire, though, much sooner than they did under the Inflation Reduction Act. There's incentives for energy storage. They extend a little bit past the incentives for solar, but they still expire sooner than under the Inflation Reduction Act. There are incentives for carbon capture and sequestration. And one of the call-out box you see here is by the end of 2039, those incentives under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act for carbon capture and sequestration drop off. So at a kind of a high level here, how these different types of resources fit economically into Zealand's system are really driven by assumptions on PA 235. Because on the chart on the right, where we're planning to meet the requirements of PA 235, that's where we start to see the addition of new carbon capture or new renewables and carbon capture and sequestration. But those types of resources don't show up in the business as usual. So if the model is not told, hey, we need to have a certain amount of our generation come from resources that meet renewable standards and clean energy standards, it won't just economically find that carbon capture and sequestration and new renewables are a fit. Does that help to?
Yeah, definitely. That question was kind of coming from this meeting I went to earlier this week for RWE, and they were talking about how this German company was able to utilize some money from Lansing to fund a potential solar farm in the area. And I was thinking, oh, well, if they're able to use that money,
Yeah. So let me
BPW.
take that a little bit different angle on how that all works. So RWE is a developer of solar and wind. Oftentimes, and I don't want to say this is the case, Lance, this is just general, there are incentives that project developers get from being in certain areas, local tax incentives, not just project developers, but anytime a large industrial project comes to town, there's going to be some tax incentives associated with it. So when we look at the assumed costs for new solar, new energy storage, we make assumptions on what it's going to cost for a developer to come in and do that. And those assumptions are intended to kind of capture all of those elements, the developer's return on investment, any incentives they may get, and just kind of be a representative estimate of the all-in cost. And in this case for renewables, For solar, we would have different assumptions for how tax credits come into play, because once they drop off, the price for those new renewables, all else equal, you never know how the market's going to react to things. But tax credits put the cost of these projects down here, and those tax credit goes away, then the cost for those projects maybe comes up here. So local incentives aren't explicitly addressed. We're not assuming that we get any sort of reimbursement from any government entity, but we've developed our assumptions for the cost of these resources to be reflective of the incentives that are out there. But if they came in, they decided to build in a certain city or township and they got some sort of tax abatement or something, then that's very, very specific to that project. And that's that those sort of incentives, that sort of maybe a community, how projects are received, those sorts of considerations really affect where the developers decide to move forward with their projects. Any other? Yes, sir.
When I viewed these slides at home, I thought I was seeing in the PA 235 scenario, a pretty significant component of wind, which my thought isn't reflective of anything that's current. You always hear solar long before you hear wind. Are we going to see that kind of wind development, that it actually becomes available to you? And I'm assuming if it is, you're not going to build them at the football stadium. You're going to buy into a big project somewhere.
Yeah.
So when we, IRPs consider a lot, but there's also some very specific, like your example with RWE, your example here is very good example of sort of the granularity that comes next. When you're doing planning, we make some overall assumptions. In this case, specific to wind, we're assuming, and solar, that the cost for the projects or the resources that the model is looking at are based on larger scale projects. We don't know where they're coming from. The further out you put them, all else equal, then you sort of get into some transmission considerations. But locally, there may not be land available, and then you have to scale down the size of the projects, and you avoid some transmission, but then you're escalating the cost of building it because you have economies of scale that tend to favor lower costs for larger projects. So what we're trying to get through the IRP is some direction, and Bob and Steve will talk about it a little bit later here, is, okay, with that direction, what should we be focusing on in the near term, and then how do we go about refining those assumptions? Because I'll keep using the RWE as an example. They are a developer, there's others, but you get some direction that says, hey, we should be looking for some increment of solar. Well, then you start to assess what opportunities are out there. What do we already know about? How can we maybe become a part of a larger projects and capitalize on some lower costs than if we were to do it ourselves? And that implementation and procurement piece is really, that's the meat of the action plan that comes after the IRP. So the IRP points you in the direction, and then you go after the details from there. So this is similar graphics, but this is where we delay the availability of those large resources, the large combined cycle to 2035, rather than have it be available in 2030. So very similar. I'm not going to keep flashing back and forth, but I'm going to do it once here just to kind of put it in perspective. Doesn't really have an impact on what we're seeing in 235, but it does push out. If you can't do the combined cycles in as early as 2030, well, then you have to do something else. And in the business as usual, it's picking up some new local peaking or new reciprocating engine RICE units. And then you've made those decisions to meet your load before 2035. And then it delays what you've put in after 2035. To some extent, because you've already added enough capacity early on. But the trend is still there. you put in that kind of the new peaking resources, the new recip engines, as a way to bridge you until you can get to adding new combined cycles. And then as soon as that capacity is available, you start to look for opportunities to participate in a new combined cycle. And then we sort of have the same thing, except that on 235, when we saw there was some benefit of putting in some combined cycles early, when you have to do other things early in the process to meet your load, then your balance of resources after that is still mostly renewables and carbon capture and sequestration and energy storage. If you don't put your combined cycles on early under PA 235, then there's not an economic case to be made to put them on later. So understanding kind of what the real timeline would be for participation in a new combined cycle is something that we'll have to hone in on. And again, these are bookends. We'll talk a little bit about what if we land somewhere in the middle with 235. So that's something that needs to get considered as well.
Maybe a quick question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. The new local peaking, I apologize, that is
Reciprocating internal, kind of similar to the units we have now.
purchase or,
We are modeling them as we add some new units that we own.
okay.
The Hans, like the Hans
Yeah.
system resources similar to, we have nominally 36 megawatts right now
Yeah.
that we operate in that similar capacity.
Okay, so that would be a purchase, and then the new NGCC below that would also be a purchase, just a little pushed out a little bit.
Yeah, I just want to make sure when we say purchase, you're purchasing new units.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Owned.
Owned
Yes,
units,
maybe
right.
is a better word. But in the other graph, you own, or we own, new NGCC earlier. I'm a little confused. Why couldn't you just,
Well, likely, I think confusion, that NGCC likely to achieve the economy of scale that we're talking about here is similar to a plant like Zealand Generating.
Okay.
So, 650, that's a nearly 1,000 megawatt plant. So that'd be a much larger plant than say a Zealand would build.
Okay.
So we could end up with an ownership stake in it, let's say, like we do with Bell River. We have an 11.58 megawatt share of that resource on the other side of the state that we own and receive all associated costs and benefits with. So that could be a contractual transaction, or more likely an ownership stake in a portion of a larger facility. And that type of facility, based on its nature, a lot more capital intensive to build, but more efficient, lower energy costs, greater value capacity, so a lot more capital outlay, hard to do on a large scale, or requires a much larger scale, but that's really where you get the economic benefit and the lowest cost of energy. So you're trying to balance that. What do we need to do for resource adequacy to ensure reliability? The units we have can't operate as efficiently. So they provide similar capacity and some advantages because we can start them quick, dispatch them, but at the same time, we don't want to rely on that probably as a larger portion of our energy because our overall cost will go up. So does that help?
yeah, and in my mind, I'm thinking you guys have an almost impossible job to create all these scenarios. You've got all these different options of whether it's renewable or the GCCs, and so cost versus benefit of all these different scenarios got to be mind-boggling. And hopefully your scenario generation, you plug some stuff in and see which one is the best,
Yeah. And-
cost-effective way.
And that's why we do look at a number of variations. And the fundamental objective of the model, we talk about it like it's its own entity, but we use a very sophisticated industry standard model, Encompass. Its fundamental objective is to make sure we are serving load, so making sure we're meeting the energy requirements, having enough capacity available to meet those capacity in the time of peak, plus that reserve margin. Doing so in the most economic manner, subject to whatever other constraints that we put on it. So when I say subject to whatever other constraints, for the PA 235 scenario, that constraint is there's certain flag switches in the model. You tell units which contribute towards the requirements of 235, and then you say, okay, 235 requires this percentage of energy coming from these qualifying resources. Then the model is trying to meet load subject to those constraints in the most economic manner. And when we start to look at different load prices and different fuel prices, the timing of when different resources are available, it really starts to look at a lot of different things that you can, and we get to a series of tables here shortly that sort of start to hone in on what those commonalities are, particularly in the near term, that points you in the direction that, of what to do next.
When you talk about fuel prices, if you use today's, what's happening in the world.
Yeah.
You'd probably be shooting for the moon.
Well, and not to make light of it, but at the height of the crisis in Ukraine, fuel prices were way up here. And that was for a couple of very painful, from a cost perspective, months. And they quickly came down here. And then you get your polar vortexes come through. And they come up here, and they're very painful when you experience them, but then for a sustained period of time. So that volatility, that's also, maybe not to that extreme, but we do model seasonal, because you use different amounts of energy at different times of the year, different times of the day. We model that seasonal variation in fuel prices to help to kind of capture that, okay, we're not always saying on an annual basis the fuel prices here, it's going to go up and down a little bit throughout the year. But, and I hate to say they're one-off events because they happen more often. Michigan's in a favorable spot compared to some other places with gas supply and gas prices. I know our clients in the Southeast were dealing with, if they could get the gas, it was 10 times for a period of 2 days. It was 10 times the cost of what it normally is due to a combination of out-of-state supply issues and in-state issues. I don't think you all...
Well, we're not immune to it. I mean,
Yeah.
Winter Storm Fern, I don't want to get on a tangent, but Winter Storm Fern had significant impacts on gas costs here, and power costs became extreme.
Yeah.
And we saw that for a period of over a week at what we call LMPs, which are the market prices daily, which we're only getting a small amount of our energy from, but that was very impactful. Unfortunately, you couldn't see that get passed through, but it's just kind of a reminder of we're not immune to that. We may not have that much variation, but one event like that, which for us, I feel like, yes, it was cold, but this is Michigan. That's not that side how far the norm, outside the norm, but very impactful yet.
And when we're talking cold affecting it in Southeast, it was 25 degrees. So that, like you said, it's not 10 below. One more comment, and I'll take your question, sir. Just to touch on something you said earlier, Bob, about our local generation, though. Yeah, it may be more costly to operate than, say, new combined cycles or some other larger resources. But compared to the market, I don't know what you were running your units at, but we talked about at one of our previous stakeholder meetings how you were able to use those resources last summer, I think it was, July. It's different reasons, but time of summer peak, market prices go up as well. And having that local generation, it may not get captured in long-term resource planning and IRPs, but that local generation provides you some insulation from exposure to the market. Yeah, you can benefit from the market when the prices are favorable and the power's there. But if the prices are astronomical and or the power's not there, we can turn these units on and we know what we're going to pay for every unit of electricity we generate. Yes, sir.
Looking at the level of demand in 2050 compared to today, I guess it's more. It seems like a rather gradual growth. If you listen to national news at all, they keep telling us we got to double our capacity within a decade because we're going to grow so fast and there's so much demand. Why are we not being impacted by that more national phenomenon, or is that not reflected in the model?
I think the national phenomenon is probably very nuanced, and you're looking at kind of an aggregate that may be several data points influenced disproportionately. But I think when you hear about demand moving forward, it's driven a lot by large industrial growth and data centers. Both of which have a little bit of uncertainty in how much of that is actually going to materialize. I know Zealand, your load is very heavily weighted towards commercial and industrial already. How much more can be added? We do have a load forecast that has some significant load additions, and that's why you start to see, kind of look at in the near term, we have a a ramp up, and then from there it's pretty levelized. So we are capturing what we feel has some certainty on load growth. I haven't looked at the average annual growth, but if you looked at what the forecast is compared in 2050 compared to 2026 on a average annual percentage basis, that's a very different picture than the growth from 2030 to 2050 after all those near-term additions already captured.
That's a forecast. The ramp up there is reflective of load growth that we're anticipating. So customers that have already either contacted us or that have already been in the news and have expressed, hey, we're expanding. We have an idea what that is, maybe not exact, but that's been incorporated. The majority of it, the rest of it that you see that trending upward, it's 2 to 3% year over year. And that's what we call econometric growth. So that gets modeled really for MISO as part of grid planning and load planning as a whole. And it's based on a number of factors, really census data, economic activity, GDP, all kinds of things that factor in to kind of get based on accepted methodology of how to best model that. We could have one customer come to town and that could totally change, but you have to model it. So it's based on, I would say a reasonable, you're not trying to over project, you don't want to under project. And that's another reason why every, few years, 5 years, we need to revisit this. At least every year, dealing through MPPA, we're revisiting that load forecast. And if we know we have a significant customer coming to town or something significantly changing, as soon as we have some solid data, we're incorporating that into the model so we can start planning for that. Because it takes time to get those resources. And also make sure on my counterpart side here in the T&D that we have the infrastructure in place to serve it. We're in a great position there, but you see somebody come to town that's maybe 20 or 30 megawatts or a data center, which could be as much or much more than our entire load. So I think when you look nationally at the data center growth and the overall demand with electrification, I'm not surprised by some of those statistics. Are we going to see that here? Maybe, maybe not. So.
Maybe the local government, the data centers, they say, okay, that's going to skyrocket the need for energy. But they're also saying, all right, if you guys want to set up shop somewhere, you create your own energy. So I don't know if you guys are hearing that also, because I thought that was the big reason for the spike. Here, it's growth and, businesses that want to come in. Huge spike for that. That's what.
Yeah. I think the reality of the data centers, they need so much so quickly that utilities as a whole are having challenges serving that load. So the data centers have really recognized that, and they're not in the utility business, but they have a lot of resources that will step up and try to fill that.
Yeah, and maybe a comment, what you're seeing now, data center load growth is so binary, and it's such a risk for the utility and the existing customers. Investor-owned utilities like Consumers, DTE, will take on those customers and they'll say, we'll build a resource just for you, but you're gonna have to sign a contract for almost 2 decades with us to essentially backstop the cost of that resource. And the Michigan Public Service Commission for the investor-owned utilities actually has mandated that. Because what they don't want to have happen is a giant resource to get built for a new load. The new load doesn't materialize, or maybe they leave town. Now the remaining customers are on the hook for that cost. So I think if there ever were to be a data center that comes to Zeeland, Zeeland would be in a similar situation to the investor-owned utility that says, we're gonna have to build a resource for you. This is like an isolated binary type of situation, and you're gonna sign a contract with us to de-risk or eliminate risk for the rest of the customers.
Okay, good questions. Are we good to move on? Any other questions? Okay. So the last series of charts here, there's no combined cycle showing up because I'm looking at the wrong chart, sorry. There's no combined cycle showing up because this is local generation only. So this says anything that we need to meet our future capacity requirements has to be local. It's the recip engines or small combustion turbines or renewables. And that's what you start to see in the out years of the business as usual, a little bit of renewables coming online. The little couple boxes of light blue are just capacity purchases that we might need in the near term before we get out to the 2030 timeframe. But then in PA 235, again, there was overall less need for combined cycle, but there was need for combined cycle with carbon sequestration. But that carbon sequestration is not a local resource. So this, if you're doing local generation only, what we're seeing is, to meet the requirements of PA 235, a mix of renewables and energy storage, and no new recip engines in the early time frame, but they'll start to materialize in the later years of the study. So that everything, these charts were all on a capacity basis, the megawatts time to serve at the time of peak. These are on a generation basis, series of charts. And so that generation is it's synonymous with energy, what we need to serve our energy requirements. And there's no planning reserve margin on energy, so there's just a single black line for our forecast energy requirements. That's what you see at the top. And then going back to that fundamental objective of the model, one way or another, the model's got to use its existing resources plus what it adds to meet that load. And none of these are intended to be the graphs we already talked about. This chart, the next one's intended to say this is what we're doing for the next 25 years. But you can start to see some trends. And what we're seeing on the economically optimized strategy under business as usual, well, it's kind of maybe stating the obvious here, but we're putting all this combined cycle, and the model's only adding it because it makes sense to put it in and operate it. So we show a whole lot of energy from new combined cycles in the business as usual. And then we have solar, and I think to your point earlier, so there's a mix of solar and wind. We've broken it down here on the generation charts. When we get into PA 235, you can see that those combined cycles that were added from a capacity perspective, they operate a little bit, but most of our energy is coming from solar and wind, and then carbon capture and sequestration in the pink shade. And then we have market purchases, and we know we have access to the market at times, and it's economic at times. With PA 235, interaction with the market might look very different, because if everybody is planning to meet the requirements of PA 235, can you rely on purchases from the market that are compliant, that count towards PA 235? So there could still be, particularly as the requirements for energy, clean energy and renewables ramp up under 235, there could still be some component of purchases from the market. But if that future materializes, how you go about confirming that what you're purchasing from the market counts or doesn't count to 235 is going to be another factor for consideration. So this just illustrates, okay, we put in all this combined cycle, we're really going to be using it. We're really going to be getting a lot of generation in the business as usual from these new combined cycles if we can get them online and participate in them. But then we go to this next chart where, okay, we don't put them online as early as 2030 because we can't. Instead, we add new local generation. That local generation gets used early on, sort of pushes out the overall mix of capacity and generation from that new combined cycle. But still, by the out years, you're really utilizing a lot of combined cycle generation. So this sort of starts to tell us, boy, combined cycle, regardless of when we can get it, might be something that we want to pursue an opportunity. And then, yes, sir.
When we say combined cycle, technology is that Holland Energy Park?
That is a smaller combined cycle, right? So in general, it's a resource that combusts fuel to generate electricity or energy. And then instead of we use the term waste heat, but instead of not doing anything with it, there's another piece of equipment that captures it, turns it to steam, puts that steam through a generator. So there's more equipment to it, but what you're getting from the steam generator piece is more or less free because otherwise it's going to be wasted heat. So that's a good example, that's right. So a little bit more complex, which is why they tend to be larger units, have more costs associated with them up front. But the larger the units, the more heat you can capture, the more free energy you get from the steam side. So for PA 235, when we have a delay in large units, again, it doesn't affect 235 as much because we didn't have as much combined cycle coming on in 235. And then as we go to local generation strategy, we have a whole lot more generation from our existing as well as our new recip engines that we were adding under the business as usual. And for PA 235, to the extent we can comply, we use our existing resources, but then it's a mix of solar and wind and energy storage making up which kind of is, again, partly stating the obvious because we know by 2030 we need to be 50% of our energy needs to come from those resources and growing thereafter. So before we start to kind of hone in on the different amounts and different types of capacity coming online in different periods, any questions on what we've shown with capacity and generation charts? Yes, sir.
So at this RWE talk, it didn't seem like the public was really in favor for the solar farm that was proposed. I think mostly due to where the solar farm was going to be built. They were saying that it was on prime farmland, which, you know, I could agree with. But have you guys given any consideration to where you would build your solar farm? Would it be maybe on top of parking lots or on top of existing buildings, or would it also be needed to be on prime farmland?
You want me to answer that, Bob?
Go ahead.
For the most part, MPP and our members look to contract for solar, and that's a whole conversation, but essentially that means you have an independent developer building these projects. The cheapest way they can build projects is on prime farmland, unfortunately, just because the terrain is favorable, the clearing of the land is favorable. It's typically flatter in nature, which from an irradiance perspective and capturing that energy, you have less shadows, et cetera. So unfortunately, that's just the reality of, for a developer to build the most cost competitive solar.
Right.
They need to pursue that farmland, and if they don't, somebody else will, and they're not gonna be able to market a competitive project.
Yeah. Another concern I kept hearing was the fact that we don't have very many sunny days, and maybe there's other renewable energy like biogeneration or hydro generation. Have those been considered for the renewable sector?
No. We've looked at solar and wind. I have to look at 235. There's a lot of there are differing opinions on the environmental benefit of biogas, biomass, waste to energy, landfill gas. I don't remember off the top of my head. Do those count towards 235 clean energy?
Well, ultimately, it's not carbon-free, so that's, I know there's distinctions between the renewable and the carbon. So we actually had a PPA with Autumn Hills, the generation out there. Right? We actually received all that energy from 2008 through 2023, and so they're doing something different. Kinder Morgan now owns that project, and gas is being converted to renewable natural gas, but one of those, I would say, that reasons that they're falling out of favor is because it's not nearly as economic, even though the gas, methane is a byproduct of the landfill decomposition.
Right.
There's a lot of wear and tear and O&M costs on the units, much higher than running natural gas. So for context, at the time, our purchase power agreements were around $100 a megawatt hour, which by landfill gas standards, I can let Steve chime in, we're probably one of the better contracts that were out there. Alternatively, on some of the renewable projects we're in now, well, we executed those 5-6 years ago, we were paying less than half that. Yeah. So that gives you some idea where those costs were, plus it wasn't carbon free. So we were sad to see that go, but I mean, economically, it just made sense for them to do their thing and for us to look for alternatives. It was a small project, but
Okay.
I do agree that there's benefits to that versus just flaring it. So if you're not doing renewable natural gas, then at least put that gas to use and do something beneficial. But
And we've talked a lot about what is showing up. Maybe we could talk about something that's not showing up, which is new nuclear, small modular reactors. There's a lot of interest in small modular reactors, and they're called small modular because compared to Palisades, compared to something that's maybe 1,000 megawatt units, these are new technologies, governments backing them, technology companies are backing them, data centers are backing them. They're getting a lot of interest, and they are nominally 300 to 600 megawatt. Nuclear units, very different design than Palisades and those other generation of nuclear units. Those could,
Do you want to talk about hydro?
yeah, well, I was just going to kind of finish my thought on nuclear. Like, instead of carbon capture and sequestration, there could be new nuclear coming in. It's probably around the same all-in cost, maybe, depending on who you ask and the scale of projects. It's a little bit maybe further at a commercial utility scale development-wise. So it sort of underscores the importance, and I'd love for you to talk about hydro, because I think it's an interesting, yeah. Oh, I was hoping you would. No. But so new nuclear is something, one of those technologies that as we revisit our resource plan for longer term resource additions, nuclear might be part of the mix, or hydro, or, I mean, and stuff is very geographic, different areas of the country, they're doing different things with pump storage and hydro projects. I don't know off the top of my head what the potential is for hydro here in the Midwest. There's other things that may contribute. At some point, the requirements of PA 235 are a combination of renewables and clean energy standards. So, you know, the landscape may change quite a bit as some of these other technologies continue to develop over the next several years. But like using SMRs as an example, I don't think you guys want to be the pioneers and have the first SMR unit. There's probably some larger entities or private entities that would do it. Yeah, sorry, small modular reactors that would do those types of resources, and the industry learns, right? We see what our colleagues in other parts of the country are doing, what the other utilities are doing, and then having a demonstrated track record of safe and reliable operation. Maybe then the emphasis on nuclear as an option elsewhere starts to increase. So I thought that was an important piece to say that we're looking at representative costs for different technologies. Those technologies will evolve over time. 15, 20 years ago, solar was an emerging technology. We were like, oh, well, solar maybe comes down the line in a few years. Well, we know solar's here. Now it's just a matter of, it's demonstrated. It's just some uncertainties on the cost. And to your points, I think what you're getting at is real world siting implications, whether it be a developer where you're shifting that burden to, that's what they do, or a utility who's out looking for land, trying to find the best land to use is a challenge. And you could do rooftop. I mean, they put solar on ponds, they put solar on top of landfills, but the overall economics change. And when you're talking about the amount of land you need for every unit of solar generation, it just tends to be more favorable on a flat piece of land.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Any other questions before we move on to commonalities here? And I want to get through this pretty quickly to turn things over to Steve. So this capacity mix table, there's a series of them kind of highlighting key takeaways of those charts that showed the capacity for the different scenarios and portfolios. So we've got our 3 business as usual cases: economically optimized, large units available, local generation, and then same thing for PA 235. So those are our scenarios and our portfolios within each of them. We showed that we have a need for capacity materializing in the 2030 timeframe, but we also have some flexibility. We have that good foundation of renewables to build on. So And the first thing here is what we've already talked about. Participation in a relatively larger natural gas combined cycle unit does provide value, particularly if you can do it in a manner where that combined cycle can be retrofitted or built with carbon capture and sequestration. It's another thing. You can build a combined cycle and add that technology later. It's not as easy as just bolting it on. But if you design your resource and site it in the right location, you can add carbon capture and sequestration at a later date if it's needed.
True, I thought from our last meeting, you had a graph that was extremely beneficial. It had all the different energy sources that you could buy, purchase, buy outside. And then it was the cost of implementation, the cost to maintain, the cost to run, and then the overall energy output. And it seemed like NGCC and with CCS were by far the most cost-effective purchase we could make. And that's what showed up on your graph, and that's what's showing up here.
And NGCC, yes, it is. When you start to introduce carbon capture and sequestration, again, that only shows up as economic if we have to meet the requirements of 235. But NGCC on its own, it's a technology that's very demonstrated, certainly not first of a kind generation. The supply chain has been affected like everything else recently, but there's a lot of companies who make the equipment, and there's a lot of companies who install them, and there's a lot of companies that operate them. So, yeah.
And it seemed like that's what would flush out if it was business as usual, or
Yeah,
the PA 235 requirements come down.
yeah.
And then if PA 235 stays as is, you're buying solar, you're buying wind, you're buying.
Yeah.
Just
And the key there is the pieces, though, of it, because on a per unit basis, per unit of electricity basis, the costs for NGCC may be economic. But again, if Zealand can't get slices or participation at the right size, then from an overall cost perspective, you don't want to bite off more than you need. From a cost perspective, and then it also becomes a reliability perspective. We use the term shaft risk, but how much of all of our needs do you want tied up in one resource? If there is an operational issue or a transmission issue associated with that power coming from that resource, it becomes a consideration.
putting all your eggs in one basket. Probably a good thing.
Yeah, diversify. So we talk about diversification from a fuel perspective, but also from a shaft risk perspective. And that's another benefit of having multiple small units, assuming it's not it's a unit-specific issue, not a location-specific issue. When one doesn't work, you can turn the other one on. So local-only strategies rely more heavily on renewables and peaking resources. You can see in that sort of that time frame that's illustrated, or the period of the box, the chart that's illustrated, we've seen new peaking resources really coming online in the 2030 time frame. And we have renewables, depending on the scenario or the case, coming online throughout, but more heavily weighted towards the PA 235 requirements. Again, I keep going back to it. It would be a very different story, I think, if Zealand did not have any existing renewable resources, but we're building off of our foundation and saying how new types of resources fit. We don't see, even though we gave it the ability to pick up some new peaking resources prior to 2030, the model's not showing a benefit until we really have that more significant need for capacity to meet. So we can't really benefit from the energy from it unless we need the capacity. If we just focus on the business as usual and not PA 235 requirements, then incremental new renewable resources don't show up as being selected. And to your point earlier, wind is showing up as economic. Some of the same, well, not same issues, but similar themes about the challenges you've mentioned with siting solar, maybe amplified a little bit by federal government opposition to particularly offshore wind, but even wind development. There's a lot of resistance, I think, to renewables that if we were having this conversation 4 years ago would not be part of the conversation, but they're very real considerations. Okay, what do we look at when we start to, we've gone through a lot of resources, a lot of different ways to look at it. How do we make sense of all this? So we look at a number of different metrics. Reliability, affordability, control, that's the local generation, resiliency, how do different resource mixes and portfolios respond to changes in fuel prices and load growth, renewable energy, reductions in CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, and flexibility based on potential changes to PA 235. Those are all things we consider. Zealand did late last year your customer survey. So as we, Bob, you cover them a little bit later in one of your slides, but when we talk about how we make sense of all this, we weight the different criteria in accordance with what we heard from the customers in response to that customer survey. So again, there's a lot on this chart here, but this is trying to give you an idea of the overall magnitude of difference in costs between our different cases, and you can compare them for each case across the different scenarios. But the way this is structured is within the business as usual scenario, we're comparing the economics of the economically optimized case against the case where we don't allow for new generation, large units until 2035. And then we're also comparing the local generation case against the economics of the case where you don't allow for large units available until 2035. That's why there's the zero showing up in the incremental cost on the large units cases. And we do that same thing within the PA 235 scenario.
That graph right there tells me there's probably a lot of support for what that state government representative said. Hey, there's no way we can do it. I mean, that's a 50% increase in cost.
Yeah.
To meet that PA 235. It's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, and we have a couple bullets later that talk about the potential range of incremental cost to comply with 235. I would encourage you all to treat that as illustrative of the concept and not hold on, because there's so many different, I say hold on to the specific number. There's so many different variables in here with long-term load forecast, long-term fuel forecast, changes in the market, new technologies coming online, potential changes in how renewable contracts are priced. But it does give some indication that, yeah, based on 235 as currently in place, there's an economic premium to achieve it. And I think we have like ranges of 20 to 40%. The point is there is a cost to comply with it, and we are, as a responsible utility, looking at different ways to comply while mitigating our risk exposure. And one of the ways to mitigate risk exposure is not go all in, kind of take some incremental steps. I think we've talked about the benefit of participation in large units if they're available. Start to look for those opportunities. Yeah, local generation is higher in cost. That makes sense because these are relatively more expensive units to operate. But if you can't participate in anything else and you don't want to have increased risk to exposure to the market, you're hedging your risks and you're in control of your own generation. So there is a benefit of that local generation. This presents similar information in a little bit different way. This is the 30 to 40% I was mentioning on the 235 premium. But you can see that sometimes it's helpful, instead of looking at things on like a $billion basis over the next 25 years, to try to look at it over a cost of unit electricity. So there's a practice in resource planning called levelized costs, where you take a series of future costs and then you kind of amortize them, you bring them back to current dollars, and you express them over the amount of generation over that period. So that's what we're capturing in this cost per megawatt hour. It's often used as, oh, this is our rates. No, it's not our rates, but sometimes people think of the cost for electricity on a per megawatt hour basis, and this is an equivalent way of doing it. So yeah, to your point, this is showing that there's a fairly significant incremental cost to complying with 235. Based on how these resource plans look, though, again, we're not going to say that nothing's going to change between now and 2050. But based on the analysis done, that's the incremental cost for compliance. Similar charts here as far as sensitivity to fuel prices. Economically optimized, maybe it has the widest range of exposure to fuel prices because, as we saw, it's got a lot of combined cycle gas use, but it's consistently lower in cost than the other cases that we looked at. Under the business as usual, and then even under PA 235, if we get to a high fuel price, similar story, although you start to see the economically optimized and the high fuel price under PA 235 has a little bit more exposure to high fuel prices. And I think that's just because there was some combined cycle generation showing up prior to 2035 in the PA 235 case. So overall, it's the most sensitive to fuel prices, but putting on new combined cycle as early as possible is still the most economic approach. And this looks at things a little bit different, kind of a range of how costs under the different scenarios and cases change based on different load forecasts. So you can see on the left, under business as usual, there's really not much sensitivity to the cost per megawatt hour for economically optimized or large units available after 2035. Local generation is going to be more sensitive to load variations. Under 235, you actually see a little bit of a decrease in costs, or cost per megawatt hour between low load and the reference case and then the high load. And that's because the way we do the model is you commit to some of these resources, and then maybe 5 years from now, you realize your load forecast is changing, but at some point you've made commitments, and we keep those as new resources. So what does this all mean? How do we go about, we call this a scorecard or a ranking table. You can see at the bottom of the table, we assign the weights based on the feedback we got from the customer engagement survey, which was weighted more heavily towards reliability and affordability as the most important metrics, control of that local generation at 15%, and then we spread out the rest as far as resiliency and being able to respond to load growth changes and carbon emissions. And what it says, basically, the scorecard evaluations support what we've just said through the series of previous slides, that economically optimized with participation in new large resources is the best scoring, the lowest scores being good, being the best. So compared to within the business as usual, or even within the PA 235, that economically optimized case is the top ranked case, and supports the notion that if there's opportunities to participate in those new large resources, that should be something that we're looking into. Uncertainty on 235, again, we don't know if it's going to change. If it does change, we don't know what those changes are going to look like. Changes in compliance targets, changes in the years, some combination thereof. But we did look at a scenario where we modify or we alter PA 235. And what that analysis tells us is, if we don't go all in on renewables, we don't get to meeting the requirements of 235 as quickly as possible, that is a good way to mitigate our risk. And putting on some new form of local generation actually is a little bit more robust solution in a scenario where 235 is delayed, because that combined cycle that you put on, I think there's some benefits to it. If there is no 235, if there is 235, you shift some of your generation to that new combined cycle. But if we're going to delay but not completely abandon our pursuit of renewables, you can do that in small increments by putting on some local reciprocating engines. So to your point, we've looked at a lot of different things. There's all these what ifs, and what we're trying to do is inform decisions that leave us with the least regrets and leave us with that flexibility. And based on everything we've looked at, there's a benefit of a mix of some new combined cycle, some new local recip engines, and pursuing renewables, so long as PA 235 is going to materialize in one form or another. So overall observations and conclusions, we do have that flexibility with our open capacity purchase. If we kind of ease into procuring new renewables instead of trying to meet our 50% or 75% target all at once, there's some benefit there. Gives us the flexibility to adapt to changes that may occur related to 235 compliance. Seeking those opportunities for participation in larger generating units, but also looking at adding potentially new recip engines as a way to mitigate our risk of changes with 235 as part of our solution. And yeah, that price premium or the cost premium on 235, again, we put it on here just to illustrate that it's out there, but that range is really driven by the assumptions we've used, and changes to assumptions are going to affect that range. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bob, unless there's any questions I can help with before doing so. No? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Brad. Piece of cake, right? So it's easy decisions.
The bookends, and we're
Yeah.
leaning towards business as usual with some of the bookend going to be sprinkled in, but not the bookend. It's maybe closer to that end. And then we talked about in the last meeting, okay, what if we don't care about PA 235 at all? What's the ramification of that? And you said, well, you have to have a plan, but you don't necessarily have to execute the plan. And I don't condone, I think that would be somewhat of an integrity issue.
Mhm.
That we're going to do that,
Right.
but no, who cares about that? But a mix of it is probably best, and that's what you guys are doing. And if we don't meet that, and it actually comes into fruition, we pay a penalty, or maybe even not that. Nobody really knows. I thought you guys said that. There might be a penalty, might not be. Nobody said what happens if you don't meet it. Is that still true, or?
I think there's some, so to your point, if we're non-compliant, if 235 doesn't change and we're non-compliant, there are some, and I guess jump in here, Steve, if I go off on, or go off on a detour, but there are some, as we're approaching that and you start to recognize, hey, there's challenges, the state does allow for us to modify our plan. We have to have a plan. We have to be able to move towards that. The state did provide some, I don't want to say off-ramps, but understand that could be challenging. That said, how long can you push that? You can't just say we're not doing anything, we're not moving there, or I think have a plan that's unrealistic. Number one, that's disingenuous. That's not who we are. I agree with your comment. I mean, from our integrity perspective, we want to plan and we want to execute on that plan to the best as we're able. And I think that's what the state's looking for. The true penalties for noncompliance, I don't know what those are, but I mean, ultimately, I think as an upstanding utility and someone who's, we can disagree with the politics, we can disagree with what was enacted by the legislatures, but the people of Michigan represented the people that, or voted for the people that made those decisions. So I think we respect that and we want to abide by that and adhere to the extent that we're able to. At the same time, we're recognizing the challenges that were presented, and we're saying if we move too fast on this, there's significant cost implications, which we're hesitant on. And by no means have we been delaying renewables. I mean, we're by megawatt hours over 20% today. And I would say that's been a great story because there's a lot of great reasons we did that, but they also economically stood on their own as we looked at other resources. So as we continue to pursue that. We're still looking for those opportunities. The market shifted, they've become a little more expensive. And so, but that is not out of hand, and that's why we use the term aggressively pursue. And I think that's where we look at it, where there's opportunity, where it makes sense. And I think we still have to look at picking away at that and doing some small bite-sized pieces in our portfolio where it makes sense. Or if we see a larger opportunity, we jump on that. But at a point, not to a point where it's going to be significantly impactful to rates. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yeah, I mean, what I saw in all the graphs, it seems to follow exactly what the survey said. And, you know, that last slide was the survey. Cost effective, reliable. I mean, all the companies here are like, I want my energy to work and work reliably. Otherwise, I don't make money. So that's by far most important. And then cost is the second. And the renewable part, I think everybody would agree we want it, but we don't want to pay 40% more or whatever to sprinkle it in and start to move that way and not need to be. I think it's perfect. It seems like to me.
yeah, and we know from customers we've talked to, I mean, we know that there are sustainability goals, decarbonization goals, but I think those, and I think time, as I said before, I think time as we get more advanced technologies, I think there'll be more opportunities to do that at scale at cost that is more reasonable. So again, I think we're trying to take a measured approach there. So want to move on to short-term action plans or near-term action plans. I'll go through this quickly, and then I want to introduce Steve here. Number one, ensure resource adequacy to maintain reliability. So that's number one. We've been talking a lot about energy and capacity, but ultimately, without the capacity, whether we have it on system, own it, operate it, or we have contractual obligation to it, we need that to be able to serve our load. So that's paramount. Number two, looking at these larger projects where the economies of scale come into play, as Brad just mentioned. So, and then monitor PA 235 and potential policy changes. So we're not dismissive of that, but I think we're trying to be pragmatic and then continually to reassess. Plan for compliance with current requirements while advocating kind of a conservative approach. We don't want to move too fast. Yeah, we know we have to meet our load requirements. So, and then just continue to pursue renewables where we see that they're available and they make sense for us. In all of this, as I kind of started out the meeting with the introductions, MPPA has been a key partner with us, for many, many years. It started actually, I think, with the Val River project that actually came online in 1983 or 1984, and we receive energy from every day. So along those lines, the PPAs we've talked about, the large-scale solar, the large-scale wind projects we're in, many more are all a result of Steve's team at MPPA and our collaboration with them. So as we look to the future here, Zealand can do stuff on our own, but you've clearly seen the benefits of doing things at scale. And that's where the agency has similar goals, objectives, and I think there may be opportunities here to partner. So I've invited Steve to come speak a little bit and talk about those opportunities and some initiatives that the agency is doing. So thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Bob.
Appreciate the opportunity to be here, everybody. Quick introduction. My name is Steve Donkersloot. I'm the Director of Strategic Energy Resources and Services at Michigan Public Power Agency. No one knows what that means. Essentially, it means I'm responsible for long-term investments and contracts at the agency as well as services. Been with the agency 5 years. Left Lowell Light and Power, another municipal electric utility, in 2020 to join MPPA. I had been there since '09. Born and raised in Zealand. Family still here, parents, brother, family, friends, and went to school right down the road at Hope College. So always a treat to get back to the hometown. But I'm going to piggyback off of what Bob just highlighted. We heard a lot of great stuff earlier today about planning, but how do you take what's in that plan and now implement components of that plan? I think that's where there's an opportunity for MPPA and Zealand to work together. There's a lot of writing on this slide, and I'm going to go through some of this, but a lot of that's for the folks reviewing this slide deck outside of this meeting. MPPA is really an extension of Zealand. We're a not-for-profit. Zealand actually comprises a seat on MPPA's board. I've attended various meetings across MPPA's membership. And I've had folks come up to me afterwards and said, well, what are you selling? Or you're just here to sell me something or make money. Like, no, actually, Zealand's my boss. MPPA is just an extension of Zealand. So we were formed in 1978. Really, we're a creature of state government. Act 448 of 1976 allowed MPPA to be created. We're a joint action agency, and we're a project-based joint action agency. It's important to recognize because our members can choose to participate in various endeavors through the agency, whether to take power supply or related services, or they can choose to do those things on their own. So really, we complement what our members want to do. We have certain members that look to MPPA to do almost everything. We have certain members who like to do most things on their own, and then we have a hybrid. So we believe the project-based structure is great because it basically fits what the member wants from MPPA. Everything we do is founded in projects. We have power supply projects, and we have service or planning related projects. Bob mentioned that Zealand's part of certain power supply projects. Zealand's part of Bell River, as are 10 other MPPA members. Zealand's also part of the Energy Services Project, and within that project, MPPA executes long-term contracts, as well as short-term bilateral contracts. Within that project, we've executed landfill gas, wind, and solar projects, and MPPA is the contracting party with the counterparty, and then behind MPPA is a combination of members that gets basically a slice of the pie, or a sliver of the project, if you will. Mention that we have 22 full members, 12 associates. Our 22 full members represent 85% of municipal or public power load here in the state of Michigan. There are 40 municipal electric utilities. MPPA was really set up to be an economies of scale, economy of scope, like platform for our members. You know, Zealand's a big municipal electric utility relative to their municipal peers. But even Zealand, relative to Consumers Energy or DTE, they're very small. Our largest member, Lansing, is very, very small relative to Consumers and DTE. But what MPPA provides for is this economies of scale, economies of scope platform. MPPA can invest in a resource or contract for a resource that's very large in nature. We call that utility scale in nature. Our members may not be able to do that on their own, but MPPA, because of members coming together, can invest or contract, and each member can get a slice of the pie, if you will. And therefore, they're getting cost competitive electricity to serve to their members or their customers so that they can compete with the investor-owned utilities like Consumers or DTE. So again, that third bullet point, we provide economies of scale and scope, power supply, as well as other solutions and services. This really translates to members being able to diversify their portfolio, that reduces risk, and that lowers costs. Again, that allows Zealand to remain competitive and relevant and to provide for affordable rates. Fortunately, Zealand actually has some of the lowest rates in the state, and across the municipal membership of MPPA, we're almost exclusively lower by double digits in terms of a percentage compared to Consumers, DTE, and other investor-owned utilities. I think that really covers this slide. Before I go on and leave who MPPA is, any questions or comments?
Oh, there's 22 members of MPPA, and you partner with them. And so,
Here's kind of a nice snapshot of those members.
are you guys funded by the state government?
No, our members basically cover MPPA overhead. So MPPA does not have a margin. We don't have a profit. We don't have shareholders. MPPA's sole job is to basically manage or make recommendations for our power supply portfolios, as well as offer other services. So we have staff costs, the overhead costs, the facilities, the utilities. We charge our members that cost, as well as pass on the wholesale cost of power. The vast majority of our $300 million budget is power supply, and we're agnostic to where we get that power supply. We really look to state law and what our members and their communities would like us to do. And we take those two things, marry them together, canvass and surveil the marketplace, and go try to find opportunities. We're agnostic to where those opportunities come from, the developers, the vendors, et cetera. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Maybe just an energy question.
Sure.
You got all these members and you're building energy units here and there and so on and so forth, and everybody is benefiting from them, I would assume, or maybe not everybody, but a lot of them. If we bought energy, which I think we do from the other side of the state, 1 kilowatt, whatever, and you transport it all the way to Zealand, do you lose 50% of that energy in that transportation and all that? I don't know the answer to that. I'm just curious.
So the way the electric markets and system works, it's almost like a debit and credit system. So Zealand and all of our members here either own or contract for resources outside of their local jurisdiction or their distribution system. The energy from Bell River, or maybe a solar or wind project, those electrons are not traveling to this distribution system here in Zealand. But we do know Zealand basically has rights or title to that energy, and we've injected in the market, and we also know what Zealand's withdrawing from the market, and every utility is basically doing this. So we can show, even though the electrons didn't flow here, on paper, when you settle it out, almost like a debit or credit system at a bank, kind of like you put $1 in the bank, you probably don't get the same dollar out, but you knew you had $1 in the bank. Same type of concept with energy. But there are losses on the transmission system, but it's at such a high voltage. Brian Coots probably knows this better than I can, but the losses in terms of a percentage of what's generated is very, very low, because typically it's 138,000 or 345,000 volts. This is our membership, diverse in nature. We have very small members from Portland and St. Louis, Michigan, to medium-sized members, to larger members like Zealand, Holland, Lansing, and we're spread throughout the state. And I'm not going to talk much more about this unless there's questions. Going to jump right into it now. Resource adequacy focused. MPPA is focused on a lot of things, but for the purposes of tonight's discussion, going to highlight resource adequacy. That's synonymous with reliability or capacity. But why are we focused? Similar to what we've talked about as it relates to Zealand, MPPA and the aggregate of our members have a forecasted capacity deficit of north of 200 megawatts starting June 1st of 2030. So for that reason alone, we're very focused. But there's risks associated with that deficit. And I've listed a few here. Obviously, there's financial risk. Zealand and most of our members are in the MISO market. They're the independent system operator or the regional transmission operator. Annually, they have an auction from June 1st through May 31st. You can either go to that auction having excess capacity or a deficit. It's very, very difficult to be perfect. It's just the way it works. Well, being short exposes you to that auction clearing price, and that can have financial consequences, especially now where there's a very tight supply-demand balance as it relates to capacity. Beyond financial risk, obviously not having enough capacity means you don't have enough generation to meet demand or load requirements at certain times of the year. Now there's reliability risk. If that wasn't enough, there's actually a regulatory, Public Act 341 requires that all utilities in the state make a filing in March of every year that demonstrates 4 years from now they have 95% of their capacity or reliability requirements met. So that's a state requirement. And then there's a reputational risk. When I left Lowell, came to MPPA, I didn't really appreciate the fact that the marketplace is constantly monitoring and looking at us. Lowell, very small town. Utility's been around since 1896, kind of felt like we were in a bubble. Ultimately, Lowell, Zealand, and our other members are represented by MPPA, MISO, Consumers Energy, DTE, transmission companies, people out of state. Look at MPPA, and behind MPPA are our members. And we're constantly in various dockets, participating in different regulatory venues, et cetera. So the marketplace does look at MPPA and our members from a reputation standpoint. So there is risk to not comply with law or do what we're supposed to be doing. Another reason why we're resource adequacy focused, it was mentioned in the talk this evening that there's a bilateral capacity market. You can get capacity in three ways. You can own a resource, and that has capacity value or product. You can contract for a resource, and in your contract, you can negotiate to buy that capacity product, and now it's entitled to you. The third way you can get capacity is by buying somebody else's capacity, just that product. It's called a zonal resource credit. It's a bilateral transaction. We've used at MPPA this bilateral market to kind of fill in the cracks or the gaps for the last 20 years. In the early 2000s, there was an overbuild of generation. You had the Great Recession. It set load growth back by about a decade. And you have independent power producers. There's three of them, three large ones, that for the last almost 20 years have had excess capacity. And we've been able to buy that capacity at very, very attractive rates. And it was mentioned that over time, Zeeland has their capacity portfolio going down, and a big reason for that is these transactions we've entered into have layered off or are going to layer off. Well, the reality is that market, because of supply-demand constraints, has become very fragile. I already mentioned there's a few sellers, and actually 2 of those 3 sellers are tapped out. They don't have any left. There's only 1 seller left. And there's a low supply, and the price of that capacity has more than doubled in the last 5 years. If we're reliant on a market that may not exist, that's not a good position to be in. So that market could be further challenged by resource retirements. We've all seen what's happened with Campbell. DTE has Monroe, over 3,000 megawatts of baseload coal that's slated to retire in 2028 and 2032. And then you have load growth. We already talked about industry load growth and AI data center load growth. A couple other reasons we're focused on resource adequacy. The independent system operators, in Zeeland's case, MISO, they set the rules for how resources are accredited. You may have talked about this in previous meetings, but if you install 1 megawatt of natural gas, they don't give you 1 megawatt of capacity. They give you close to 1 megawatt because natural gas is reliable. Solar, on the other hand, you install a megawatt today, they give you 0.5 megawatts in the summer season. MISO's changing that methodology, and it's going to really impair and harm renewable resources. Instead of getting 1/2 of 1 megawatt, we might get 0.05. So you're going to get 5 cents on the dollar instead of 50 cents on the dollar, according to MISO here in the late 2020s. So the rules are changing for how these resources are accredited, and that's impacting the resources that are currently in our portfolio. They're not going to be worth as much. And then finally, MPPA's bread and butter over the last 45 years has been investing in or contracting for resources that are connected to the transmission system. These are resources outside of our members' distribution systems. Challenge there is to build a project that connects to the transmission system, someone has to apply with MISO, and they have to go through a queue process where essentially the transmission system is studied, and it's determined whether or not that resource can connect. And ultimately it will be able to, but oftentimes transmission network upgrades have to be performed so that the transmission grid can support that resource. Problem is, to go through that MISO queue study process takes years. MPPA, for one of our resources, entered the queue in September of 2022. We're still in it. We're in the second phase of their study. There's 3 phases, and then there's a generator interconnection agreement process or negotiation, and then the network upgrades actually have to be built. So this transmission queue process, very lengthy, very costly. Then you need to perform the upgrades. And then, as we've talked about, this gentleman talked about the RWE project. That's a perfect example. These utility scale projects, from a permitting standpoint, very, very difficult. A lot of the times that's due to NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Nobody wants it. And then finally, the demand for utility scale projects has just driven up the cost for equipment and labor. So EPC stands for Engineering, Procurement, Construction. These contracts become very, very expensive, and oftentimes they're way, way out into the future. So I don't mean to alarm anyone, but Resource adequacy, huge focus at the agency. It's a huge focus of our members, and that's a big reason why Zeeland undertook this IRP. So what is MPPA doing to address this? In 2025, with support of the entire board, MPPA initiated a multi-year, multi-phase objective to address resource adequacy. The first phase of that objective took place last year, and we assessed with interested members their capability to install new generation connected to their distribution system that's either gas or battery in nature. And by capability, we looked at distribution system constraints, fuel constraints, environmental constraints, siting, property, permitting, and NIMBYism, if you will. That took place last year. The objective is essential to obviously address that shortfall or deficit that we forecast in 2030 and to meet PA 341's compliance requirements. Next year, we have to make a filing for planning year 3031. We don't need steel in the ground next year, but in that filing, there's a process where we can submit an affidavit that specifies this is how we intend to meet our resource adequacy requirements in 3031. We don't want to submit an affidavit that's willy-nilly. We want to know with a high level of confidence next year when we make that submission that what we put in that affidavit, we have every intention to do, and we've studied it, and we have a high level of confidence. And obviously, this objective is essential to address or mitigate or eliminate the risks I previously highlighted. So MPPA's position statement that we shared with members, the bilateral market's fragile and may be gone. Transmission grid-connected projects, already highlighted the challenges there. We really need to look at what we can control, and what we can control are projects within our member systems. So our position statement was investments in or contracts for new thermal or battery projects will be required to meet future resource adequacy needs and compliance requirements, and locating those resources within member communities is a logical strategy that leverages assets in our control. Think about projects here. You can probably find land that Zeeland, the utility, or the city owns. Zeeland is going to be probably the permitting authority. They own, operate, maintain the distribution system. You don't have to go through some queue process to connect the resource to the distribution system. From a NIMBYism standpoint, I get it. Nobody loves having a resource in their backyard, but a resource connected to the distribution system of, say, Zeeland, at least you know that's giving you local reliability benefits if, God forbid, something happened to the greater electric system. So our position is it may not be easy to install resources locally, but it should be easier than pursuing resources outside of member distribution systems. So kind of to wrap this up, and really the punchline here is in 2025, we performed this capability assessment. We had numerous members participate, numerous sites that we looked at. Zeeland ultimately has participated in this effort. And we identified 11 members across 13 or 14 sites within those 11 members, whereby we could potentially move forward with north of 200 megawatts of new generation. This year, we're proceeding with economic analysis and modeling. Within the last month, we've issued a request for information to 8 different vendors across natural gas, fuel cell, battery energy storage, and other emerging technologies that have reliability value. And we're going to get that information back. We're going to use it to model resources on a project-by-project basis to really see how these resources within these member communities stack up against one another, but also stack up against other power supply opportunities MPPA is evaluating outside of these local projects. We expect that the results will show some, if not all, projects should move forward. And if that is the case, the second half of this year will lead to more intense distribution system impact studies, phase 2 environmental studies, ton of engagement and education with our board, but ultimately getting their buy-in and support to authorize moving forward with projects. We don't know exactly when that will happen. We have a pretty sophisticated action plan, but I think we hope early 27, Q1, Q2, that should it make sense to move forward with projects, boards authorize approval, we negotiate contracts with these developers or vendors, and from there you have equipment orders, et cetera, and there's lead times, but we would expect projects to actually start being developed in late 27 to 28 and COD or commercial operation hopefully by 2030, because that's when we have our deficit that starts. Obviously, Zealand's part of this RFI. We're going to be getting information back, working closely with Zealand. And we don't know how this is going to evolve, but there's the potential for multiple projects to move forward, for members to own those projects, like they historically always have. There's the potential for a larger project in Zealand to be built, where MPPA could own a part of the project and Zealand could own part of the project. And you may not on your own build that larger project, but with MPPA and other members participating, you might have a better project. It may be cheaper for you to go that route on a per unit basis and provides local reliability benefits. We don't know what we don't know yet, but we're moving full speed ahead at MPPA, and Zealand is operating in parallel with us. No decisions have been made, let me be clear about that. A bunch of analysis is going to be performed, but really MPPA's endeavors, Zealand's participation is a real life example for how Zealand can implement solutions that address what your IRP plan is essentially calling for you to do. So with that said, I know Bob and Andy was maybe a little bit longer in terms of my talk, but I'll turn it back to others for any Q&A that they have.
I get you with one, Steve.
Sure.
A little bit off subject, I should have asked this earlier, but what position does MPPA influence what happens in Lansing? Talking about 235 a lot, and I understand perspective what's going on in legislation, but you as a front for 30 communities, do you spend any time talking to legislation? Do you have an opinion on what should happen?
Michigan Municipal Electric Association, MMEA, they represent all 40 munis from like a regulatory political point of view. MPPA works very, very closely with MMEA. The executive director, Katie Abraham, and I work closely, weekly if not daily. She loops MPPA into meetings, conversations, feedback that MMEA provides to the legislature. So as it relates to Public Act 235, we've given a lot of input. I do believe that there needs to be a delay or a reduction in some of these goals, or the mechanism in which you achieve the goals needs to be extended. There's a very unique provision in Public Act 235 that allows municipals to buy just a renewable energy certificate or credit to achieve compliance. That's by far the most cost-effective way for us to demonstrate we're renewable. That mechanism goes away starting in 2036. We've proposed legislation or amendments to legislation that would allow us to purchase those RECs indefinitely, and if not indefinitely, let us do it through 2045 instead of 2035.
You guys don't actually have staff?
No.
Something in there, but you work through.
No, Katie and her team, and they have a consulting firm, Karubin Associates, lobbying firm.
So what can we do? I mean, I can call Brad and go, hey buddy, we're against
Yes, that's exactly what you should do. 100%. Talk to your representatives. Talk to your representatives. I don't know if it's write letters or write emails or schedule visits with folks at the legislature.
Is it all state levels or any influence federally?
Not influenced federally. PA 235 is strictly state.
So you would have your finger on the pulse of what I heard this representative saying, hey, this is, the goals are way too high. There's no way we can meet it. You would have your finger on the pulse working with MEA and
Yes.
others.
Yes.
And are you going to divulge what you're thinking? Is it going to go down?
I don't want to be a fortune.
Yeah.
I think MMEA's publicly shared perspective is there's an opportunity up until the election and maybe even a lame duck. But if something doesn't get done there and you still have a house divided, if you will, where you have Republicans in control of at least one or more chambers, Democrats, vice versa, probably gridlock. And it may take some pain and suffering, whether it's reliability events or affordability, where people start crying uncle before you see the legislature want to change anything.
So maybe another quick question. Your relation to Zealand,
Yes,
and you have 22 of
40.
Zealand type
Yep.
customers, but not as big or whatever. But we just went through several slides and 3 meetings of, all right, this is the load that we see, and here's how we can mitigate that load with PA 235 in the background and so on and so forth. Were you involved in that planning, or does the local Zealand, is that all their model, and then you come alongside and say, well, you know what? All of our members together, we're gonna have a huge deficit over, if you execute that plan, but increase it to a bit, we'll throw in some funding to help you. Is that your relationship with, or do you have veto power saying, no, wait, you can't do this plan?
In terms of load forecasting, we take the lead there. Zealand provides input. We don't have any veto power as MPPA. The board is the boss. They tell us what to do. They authorize any decision in an open meeting. So it's really the board that can set the direction of MPPA and approve or not approve anything. We make recommendations. They either authorize or tell us to do otherwise. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, I kind of, maybe. I'm just trying to figure out the relationship between what we just saw and MPPA, which has a whole bunch of.
Yeah, essentially what MPPA does, we invest in power supply or contract for power supply. And Zealand can be part of those investments or contracts. MPPA will make an investment that's far more than what Zealand needs, but Zealand can take a piece of that investment or contract, and that piece will help Zealand meet the goals that the IRP is calling for. Does that help?
So, let me just add too, that this IRP is strictly Zealand's project, okay?
Yeah.
So, MPPA is offering an option for us to consider as part of that portfolio. So, it may sound like we presume this is going to, we're heading in this direction of reciprocating engines on system, but in fact, we've got to right-size this thing. We've got assets that are aging. We've known that something would need to be done at some point in time, but we've applied this sophisticated study to the process to kind of put some reality or some numbers behind this so that we can make informed decisions about the investment. Does that help?
Yeah, I think to piggyback on Andy, because we're a project-based agency, we look to our members to tell us what they would like us to do for them. So if Zealand says we want to be 100% renewable by 2035, and MPPA, we want your help, we'll do our best to try to go make that happen. If we hear from Zealand, these are the types of resources that make sense within our IRP plan or our community wants. Here's some information. MPPA will take that and try to implement that. When we do that, we always want to make sure there's at least 2 or more members participating in any contract or investment. But we look to our members to give us that feedback. Some members don't conduct, many members don't conduct an IRP like this. We wish they did. They're almost looking to MPPA to recommend on their behalf instead of the community and the utility telling us what they would like. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Can I add one thing to that? So MPPA has and does do, I would say, a lion's share of our power supply planning through the energy services project that Steve mentioned. So when we talked about this project, a lot of the data, like our current contracts, knowing what was on the horizon, load forecast, all that came from really a large way through MPPA staff. But the IRP was never intended to circumvent MPPA, but it's like, let's also get an independent resource with the different tools, different models, different ways to look at this, not to go against what MPPA is, but independently kind of validate what we're hearing in a different perspective. So Now we're looking at, we've got data, how do we execute, how do we implement? And so that was, the intent was never to do anything separate from MPPA, but maybe a different set of optics and looking at it. And now when we're talking about how do we implement, well, if we can do something together, if that makes sense, that's great. You know, there's economy of scale, there's mutual benefit. The nice thing about a project-based agency is, you know, we have latitude to do things independently as well. Because what might be right for Zealand maybe isn't right for another member, as Steve's mentioned, so.
So it's more like,
Kind of a la carte.
yeah, a la carte, but an internal partner to help execute versus, hey, we're going outside to California. They got some whiz bang energy source and they're gonna build it here in Zealand.
Right.
Well, they would go to you guys most likely to help execute the plan. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, MPPA has expertise in contracting for power. We have not built our own resources in a while. We have in the past, but yeah, members like Zealand could go to MPPA to execute a plan, or we could work together on a plan to develop a joint project.
I think Steve set the stage nicely. I mean, we're kind of as an agency and as Zealand in this position because the climate has been such for the last 20 years or more that it's been more economical to buy than it has been to build. We've all benefited from that on the rates, and so the model shifted. And so that's really been the apex here of, okay, we see this coming. We don't want to overreact, but we need to be on this, aggressive. We've been looking at that. The agency's been looking at that. And I think, you know, now it's this great opportunity to, okay, something's got to happen, and if we can do something together, that's great. We may do something independently too, and that's fine. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, it looked like 2027 was the plan to start building. Is there any projects that are already kind of approved and like ready to start moving forward?
No, this year, again, we're going through project by project economic analysis, see how projects compare and contrast against one another,
Okay.
see how those compare and contrast against other independent opportunities MPPA is evaluating. We would then choose from that menu of opportunities, recommend to members, and members will ultimately make the final decision, but the expectation and hope would be that members choose and authorize early next year, or then we would proceed with negotiations and contract execution, and that would kick off the process to start building. But the reality is construction or material lead times are so long that you may not see dirt fly, should we even come to that decision, until 2029 or 2028.
As part of that, NPPA will be doing their analysis. As Steve mentioned, they've reached out to vendors for actual, you know, real pricing. Everything in Brad's, the model through Encompass, that has been, I guess, Brad, indicative pricing, right, of where the market's at. But you aren't necessarily talking to specific vendors like, give me a quote on this, give me a quote. It's based on previous projects, you know, it kind of extrapolated where that indicative pricing would be. What Steve's getting is actually going to be real more vendor-specific pricing. So as we get that data, also as a member and as a participant, I guess I'm getting into our next steps, but our endeavor is really to help feed that back into the model at some point. Say, okay, if we look at this, we've just done a ton of great work. How does that maybe move the needle? And how does it compare with what the agency's seeing? So we've got a ton of data there. The model's in place now. Can we do some refinements on that with actual, you know, more specific data and to get better cost projections? So again, it's still going to be a forecast, but you know, hopefully providing the insights and the information we need to make the best and most informed decision possible. Any other immediate questions? I'm gonna, we are over on time. We're into overtime, so I guess that's always exciting, all right? Next step. So what's next here? Completing the IRP process. So that's approaching conclusion here. These were the preliminary results. There will be a report that will be issued at an upcoming meeting once we've had a chance to fully review that, refine that, do what we need to do as staff. We'll be presenting that to the BPW board and also City Council. So that'll be a public meeting. Look for that. I'm sure we'll send out emails on that. We'll post it on the website. So stay tuned. evaluating potential implementation pathways. So that's really just piggybacking on what Steve said. MPPA, what they're doing will be a part of that. Of course, we're looking at that independently. Similarly, we started to look at, at a high level, what sites in Zeeland that we currently own might be good locations for these resources. We do have land out at Riley, by Riley Generation. I think that would make sense. We've already got some generation there. Where other sites might be possible, and emphasize might. That doesn't mean that's where it will go, but we're looking at that, from an air permitting, environmental permitting, interconnection on our transmission system and distribution system, all the stuff Steve talked about, we're right there with it. So, and again, looking at MPPA, if it is a larger project, what can Zeeland support? What fuel supply do we have? We're working with Semco Gas, who is our gas provider. Zeeland may only need a 25 megawatt project, but if we can host a larger project, get economy of scale, the other benefit Steve didn't talk about is on-system reliability that would provide to Zeeland. Even on a larger scale, some of that power and some of that may be attributed to somebody else, but that's right here in our community. We have the staff, we have the resources, and we have, I think, there's some communities that, are much smaller that don't have the opportunity to build something like this. So if we look at, yes, it could benefit Zeeland, but it could also benefit another community that maybe doesn't have the resources and the personnel to do it. That we win-win. So looking at all of those paths. Ultimately, it's kind of an iterative process. We're going to maintain a view on what's happening. We need to maintain resource adequacy. We need to keep looking at what's happening in the market, regulatory changes, compliance changes, what's happening with PA 235. We need to stay on top of that. Continue to look for market opportunities. We've talked about these large resources. That is going to be our best, most efficient, lowest cost long-term resource. Partnering on a large-scale project, probably larger than we can build here in Zeeland, even as a joint project. And again, that may also be kind of more cost-effective, large renewable projects as they become available. It needs to be measured in a forward-looking approach with regards to risk management. So not all those eggs in one basket, kind of multi-pronged. And that's where we are today, and it's provided a lot of benefit to us. And continually align decisions with our customer priorities. What you see there listed, that was based on our October 2025 customer survey. It didn't surprise us. It was very, validating as staff to know we view reliability and affordability as number one, and two, customer service. We're very proud of that. We're all of us at BPW employees. We work for you. We work for the community. We're not for profit, but we're very proud of what we do and the service we provide. I can say that for all of my team. There's a ton of pride there. When there's an outage, we take that personally. Nobody can control that, but you better believe we want that back on, up and going as fast as possible. That's pride and community. So we want to continually assess this. Some communities, those priorities are different, and maybe reliability and affordability are still number one and two, but there's other priorities. We respect that, we understand that. And as our community changes, we want to make sure we can keep adapting to that. To kind of hit my bottom point there, continuously strive to improve service and deliver customer value. That's ultimately what we want to do. So that's what we have. We thank you very much for coming. It's been great to get to meet all of you, and it's been a really engaging discussion. Stay tuned, there's more to come. Implementation is ahead and a lot of decisions ahead.
When you finalize the IRP, is that going to be communicated back to our community?
Yep.
Either through a bill or as a flyer in the bill or something like that, say, hey, okay, we ask your opinion, here's what we came up with, and here's what we're gonna do.
We can certainly do that, Andy. We can put that right on the bottom of our bills. We can send it, it'll be posted. We'll keep the webpage up that we've created for quite a while, I believe, until probably even, not presuming that construction is imminent, but if that's where we head, or a joint project, we'll continue to provide updates on that website for a while. So we can also set out, an emails to the distribution group. We'll also want to do larger public communication to let stakeholders in the community know that that's there. So, great. So anything, I'm sorry.
Good.
Anything we haven't answered, feel free to hit us up afterwards, or our contact information is there. Thank you very much. We would like to send out a survey and just to kind of get your thoughts and any additional feedback you have. on what we've done here, and yeah, ways to contact you, and yeah, just anything you have that you'd like to share with us, ways for us to improve, we'd appreciate it. So, thank you.
Thank you.